There is a particular kind of person we have all met at least once in our lives. Someone who says very little in a meeting, who nods rather than argues, who lets a wrong idea pass uncorrected at a dinner party, who could, we sense, say something devastatingly intelligent and yet chooses, again and again, not to. We tend to misread this person. We assume that their silence is a kind of absence, an absence of things to say, or worse, an absence of courage. We reward, instead, the person who speaks fastest and loudest, mistaking volume for insight and confidence for competence. And yet, if we were patient enough to sit with the silent ones, to ask them gently what was going on behind their calm expression, we would often discover something startling, that their silence was not a failure of thought, but one of its most advanced products. This is a film about why the most perceptive among us often say the least, and about what their silence can teach the rest of us, about the strange relationship between intelligence and restraint, the overwhelm of nuance. Let us begin with a simple but under-examined fact about the mind. Thinking clearly about something usually makes it harder to summarize, not easier. The person who has only skimmed a subject can offer a crisp opinion on it in a sentence. Ask them about a complicated political conflict, a colleague's failed marriage, or the ethics of a difficult business decision, and they will answer briskly, because they have not yet encountered the parts of the problem that complicate the answer. But the person who has thought about the same question for years, who has read the history, weighed the counter-arguments, imagined the perspective of every party involved, will often hesitate. Not because they know less, but because they know too much to say anything with the tidy confidence the moment seems to require. The 16th century French essayist Michel de Montaigne built an entire philosophy around this discomfort. He filled his essays with the phrase, "Qu'est-ce que j'ai?" What do I know? Not as a rhetorical flourish, but as a genuine confession. The more Montaigne studied a subject, from cruelty to cannibalism to the raising of children, the less inclined he felt to issue verdicts. His silence, where he was silent, was not ignorance. It was the accumulated weight of having seen an issue from too many sides to reduce it to a slogan. We might say that there is a cruel asymmetry built into conversation. It rewards those who have simplified a subject and quietly punishes those who have understood it. The person who says it's complicated is technically always right, and yet in a world hungry for quick answers, being right in this particular way rarely wins anyone's admiration, the fear of being misunderstood. There is a second, more painful reason for the silence of the intelligent, the well-founded fear that a subtle thought spoken aloud will not be received as it was intended. An idea in someone's head exists in its full, careful form, footnoted, qualified, aware of its own limitations. But the moment it is spoken, it must survive translation into the noisy, imperfect medium of a conversation where listeners are tired, distracted, already forming their rebuttal before the sentence is even finished. A thoughtful person often senses with something like grief the gap between the idea as it exists in their mind and the flattened, distorted version that will arrive in someone else's. This explains why so many of history's most careful thinkers wrote rather than spoke. Writing offers a rare luxury, the chance to say something exactly once, in exactly the right words, without a listener's impatience truncating it halfway through. Marcel Proust, a writer particularly attuned to the loneliness of the intelligent, spent much of his adult life in a cork-lined room, largely avoiding society, because he had discovered that conversation could not hold the shape of his sentences, only paper could. We might understand the silence of the smart, then, not as a withholding of thought, but as a kind of protectiveness, a refusal to let a fragile, well-made idea be crushed underfoot by a discussion that has no patience for its complexity. The social cost of being right. But there is an even more uncomfortable truth lurking beneath this discussion, one that touches not on the limits of language, but on the limits of human tolerance for being corrected. To point out that someone is wrong, even gently, even with evidence, even out of genuine care, is to inflict upon them a small wound. We like to imagine that human beings are rational creatures who welcome correction as a gift. In practice, we tend to experience correction as an assault on our sense of competence, and we often punish the messenger long after we have forgotten the message. The philosopher Socrates is, of course, the great patron saint of this problem. He seems to have believed, with an almost naive sincerity, that if he simply asked people enough careful questions, they would arrive gratefully at the truth. Instead, the citizens of Athens grew so irritated at being shown the limits of their own knowledge that they eventually put him to death. It is one of history's starkest lessons. The accurate observation is not always the welcome one, and the person who makes it is rarely thanked for their trouble. Smart people, over time, tend to absorb this lesson, usually not from a courtroom, but from smaller, everyday humiliations. The friend who never spoke to them the same way again after being corrected at a party, the colleague who quietly turned against them after a well-argued disagreement in a meeting. They learn, in other words, that being right and being liked are two different currencies, and that spending too freely in the first can bankrupt you in the second. Silence as a form of kindness. It would be too simple, though, to conclude that the silent are merely afraid. Often their silence is not self-protection at all, but a genuine act of generosity. To understand this, it helps to think about what we actually want from the people around us in most ordinary moments. We rarely want, in the middle of a difficult day, someone to point out the flaw in our plan, the fallacy in our argument, or the unflattering truth about our situation, however accurate the observation might be. We want more often to be accompanied in our confusion rather than corrected out of it. The intelligent person, if they are also wise, comes to understand this distinction. They learn to notice the difference between a moment that calls for truth and a moment that calls for comfort, and they develop the discipline to withhold the former when only the latter has been asked for. This is not cowardice. It is a subtle form of moral sophistication, the recognition that being right is not always the most important thing to be, and that love, on occasion, requires the temporary suppression of our sharper observations. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, once a slave and later a teacher of emperors, put this rather more bluntly. He suggested that much unhappiness comes not from what happens to us, but from what we insist on saying about it. There is, in his philosophy, a deep respect for the discipline of silence, not as suppression, but as a mark of self-command. Why we confuse loudness with intelligence. If silence can be so wise, why do we so consistently reward its opposite? Partly, it is a failure of imagination on the listener's part. We cannot directly see the quality of someone's thinking, we can only infer it from what they choose to display. A person who speaks confidently, and often gives us a great deal of evidence to judge, perhaps flawed evidence, but evidence nonetheless. A person who stays quiet gives us almost nothing to go on, and so we default lazily to assuming there is nothing there. This is, in effect, a failure of the same kind that leads us to prefer restaurants with long, dramatic menus over the quiet, unassuming ones that serve 3 perfect dishes. Noise is legible in a way that depth is not. It takes far less effort to be impressed by confidence than to notice care. Alain de Botton has written, in a different context, about how modern societies have come to worship status achieved through visible performance, wealth, job titles, the trappings of success, while quietly neglecting the harder-to-measure virtues like patience, humility, or discernment. Something similar happens in conversation. We have built, almost by accident, a culture that mistakes the sound of thinking for the substance of it, what the silence actually contains. If we could, for a moment, listen in on the internal monologue of the quiet person in the room, we might be surprised by how much is happening beneath the surface. They are not absent. They are, more often than not, doing several difficult things simultaneously, weighing whether the moment calls for truth or comfort, translating a complex thought into a form that might survive the noise of the conversation, calculating the social cost of being right, and, quite often, simply waiting for a pause, considerate enough to let a fuller thought land. This is worth remembering the next time we are tempted to mistake someone's quiet for a lack of intelligence, or worse, to fill every silence in a room with our own untested certainties. The person who says little may, in fact, be the only one in the room who has correctly understood how complicated the question really is. A small defense of speaking anyway. And yet, It would be wrong to end here with silence quietly celebrated as the mark of the wise. There is a cost to silence too, one that the thoughtful person must also learn to weigh. If every intelligent person in every room chooses restraint, then public conversation is left to those with the least hesitation about being wrong, and history has shown us repeatedly what happens when that is allowed to continue unchecked. Montaigne, for all his self-doubt, still wrote and published. Socrates, for all the danger of speaking plainly, still spoke. Their silence was never absolute, it was selective. They reserved their words for the moments that mattered and released the rest into a considered stillness. Perhaps then the real skill is not silence itself, but discernment about when to break it. Learning, as both writers eventually did, to say the necessary thing plainly, without the need to say every true thing at all. Reflective, warm. We might end then, not with an instruction to speak more, or to stay quieter, but with a gentler reframing of what we are witnessing when we meet someone who says little. Their silence is very often not a void, but a kind of quiet labor, an ongoing act of translation, of tact, of self-restraint, performed continuously and almost invisibly, in service of getting something difficult roughly right, or of sparing someone else an unnecessary wound. It is, in its own understated way, one of the more advanced achievements the human mind is capable of. The next time we sit across from someone who says less than we expect, we might resist the urge to fill their silence with our own noise, and instead extend them the smallest, most valuable courtesy available in conversation, the patience to wait and see what, if anything, they eventually choose to say.